On the morning of August 13, 1961, Berlin is awoke to a city abruptly cleaved by steel, barbed wire, and concrete. Families were separated, friends lost sight of each other, and colleagues on one side of the wall could no longer cross to the other. The Berlin Wall had risen overnight, a chilling physical manifestation of a new kind of global conflict, the Cold War. Unlike the wars of the past, this battle had no trenches stretching across the countryside, no marching soldiers parading toward victory. Instead, it was a war of ideas, a struggle for influence and dominance across nations, where the ideological divide between communism and capitalism became the defining fault line of the 20th century. In the East, the Soviet Union and its satellite states imposed strict controls, curbing freedoms and enforcing loyalty through surveillance and intimidation. In the West, the United States led a coalition of democratic nations determined to contain communist expansion. Across the globe, proxy wars erupted. Korea, Vietnam, and countless lesser-known skirmishes were theaters for this larger, invisible confrontation. Espionage became a shadow war, with spies, defectors, and double agents moving in secret, shaping outcomes far from public view. And above it all, the specter of nuclear destruction hung heavy, a silent threat poised to annihilate millions at a moment's notice. What few could foresee was just how close the world would come to tipping into apocalypse in the decades to follow. As Berliners adjusted to life in a divided city, a larger game was unfolding beyond their streets. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, established in 1949, bound Western nations in collective defense, while the Warsaw Pact formed in 1955 to unite Eastern Bloc countries under Soviet command. Each alliance spurred an arms buildup unmatched in history. Tanks, fighter jets, and nuclear warheads multiplied. Yet beneath this industrial roar, subtle diplomacy and back-channel negotiations quietly shaped the course of events. But as military parades flaunted power in Moscow and Washington alike, no one could fully anticipate the crises looming on the horizon or how the ordinary people caught in the crossfire would react. Across the globe, ordinary citizens felt the pressure of this invisible war. Families read newspapers filled with headlines about communist victories, Western economic aid, and escalating military exercises. Fear and suspicion seeped into daily life, shaping politics and culture. Schools drilled children on nuclear protocols. Civil defense sirens echoed in quiet towns. Every new weapon tested in Nevada or Siberia added tension to an already fraught world stage. And in this tense atmosphere, a single miscalculation or a misinterpreted missile launch could ignite a conflict that would consume continents. Would leaders resist the temptation of aggression, or was the world teetering on the brink of an unthinkable disaster? Behind the closed doors of Kremlin chambers and White House offices, decisions were being made that could alter the fate of millions. Yet while generals and diplomats debated strategy, life in divided Berlin continued under watchful eyes. East German border guards patrolled relentlessly, while families devised dangerous escape plans, sometimes risking death for freedom. Newsreels showed citizens daring to climb walls or dig tunnels, acts of courage that both inspired and terrified those watching. Each night, the city pulsed with uncertainty. Could the wall stand forever, or would cracks appear under the weight of human resilience? The Cold War was no distant conflict, it was a force shaping every street, every home, and every policy. Nuclear arsenals swelled, economic competition intensified, and ideological rhetoric painted the other side as a mortal enemy. Yet amidst this tension, the seeds of diplomacy and international negotiation were quietly sown. Allies plotted, adversaries observed, and every decision reverberated across oceans. And somewhere, deep within the corridors of power, leaders pondered the ultimate question: could humanity survive a war without battlefields? Or was the world destined for catastrophe? If you're captivated by the tense drama of the Cold War and want to witness the events that shaped our modern world, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps bring these stories to more people and keeps history alive. October 1960 brought the world closer to annihilation than ever before. American reconnaissance planes had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles stationed just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, hidden deep within Cuban jungles. For 13 harrowing days, the planet held its collective breath. Every message, every decoded communication, every whispered negotiation carried the weight of life and death. President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev exchanged letters and ultimatums, their words shaping the fate of billions. A single misstep or radar misread, a misinterpreted move by a submarine captain could have triggered a chain reaction, obliterating entire cities in minutes. How close had humanity come to the brink? Eventually, a fragile compromise emerged. The Soviets agreed to dismantle and remove the missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the United States secretly pledged not to invade the island and to withdraw Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis etched a terrifying truth into the collective consciousness. Nuclear weapons were no longer distant deterrents, they were immediate instruments of potential annihilation. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, became more than a theory. It became the chilling framework guiding global politics. Yet as relief washed over the world, there was little time to relax. The arms race surged on, driven by fear, pride, and the relentless momentum of military-industrial complexes on both sides. Across the Atlantic, the United Kingdom pursued its own nuclear ambitions, developing the Blue Steel missile to arm its V-bomber force, ensuring it had an independent deterrent. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union expanded its missile programs, constructing vast anti-aircraft defenses and testing long-range intercontinental missiles. Both nations and their allies were caught in a feedback loop of action and reaction, each technological advance prompting another. Negotiations intermittently attempted to curb this spiral. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, began under President Lyndon Johnson and continued under Richard Nixon. SALT-I, concluded in 1972, established ceilings on intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched nuclear weapons, marking the first serious attempt at curbing the proliferation of devastation. But was it enough to keep the world safe, or merely a temporary pause in a dangerous contest? By the late 1970s, the uneasy détente of the early decade unraveled. The Soviets deployed SS-20 intermediate-range missiles across Eastern Europe, provoking NATO to respond with Pershing II and cruise missiles. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan shattered any lingering trust, halting Seoul to ratification and intensifying Cold War tensions. Citizens in Europe and the United States watched anxiously as their leaders debated military responses, their lives shadowed by a sense of impending doom. Could diplomacy survive the momentum of weapon systems designed to annihilate entire cities in minutes? Could political leaders restrain their ambitions long enough to prevent catastrophe? Amidst this volatile environment, intelligence agencies monitored every move, looking for signs of weakness or escalation. Submarines shadowed fleets, satellites scanned borders, and high-altitude reconnaissance planes risked being shot down, all to maintain a fragile balance. The Cold War had become a chessboard on which the pieces were cities, millions of lives, and the very future of civilization. Every crisis, every negotiation, every missile test tested not only the resolve of governments, but the resilience of humanity itself. And yet, beneath the shadow of potential destruction, cautious optimism emerged. Some believed that dialogue, treaties, and patient diplomacy might yet avert the worst. By the end of the 1970s, the world had learned a terrifying lesson. Technological superiority alone could not guarantee security, and political miscalculations could have catastrophic consequences. Leaders, aware of this delicate balance, began to explore more comprehensive agreements and verification mechanisms, attempting to reconcile strategic ambition with existential risk. But could they bridge decades of mistrust? Could the people and their governments envision a future beyond confrontation, or was the cycle of escalation destined to continue unchecked? The dawn of the 1980s brought renewed tension across the globe. Ronald Reagan, newly sworn in as President of the United States, announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a bold and controversial plan to develop a missile defense system capable of intercepting nuclear warheads in flight. While supporters hailed it as a protective shield, critics warned it threatened to destabilize the delicate balance of mutually assured destruction. In Moscow, Soviet leaders feared the initiative could render their entire arsenal ineffective, igniting a new wave of anxiety that spread from the Kremlin to the streets of Europe. Could a defensive plan provoke the very conflict it sought to prevent? Across Europe, ordinary citizens responded with action. Movements demanding nuclear disarmament surged in cities from London to Bonn. In 1983, more than 400,000 people marched through London, waving banners, chanting for peace, and demanding an end to nuclear weapons. Their voices resonated across the continent, inspiring solidarity movements and challenging governments to listen. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament (CND) was no longer a fringe group. It had become a formidable political and social force. These protests were a reminder that while governments controlled arsenals, the people could shape discourse, influence policy, and demand accountability. But could grassroots activism truly sway superpowers locked in decades of rivalry? Or was it a drop of hope in an ocean of nuclear tension? Meanwhile, arms control negotiations continued behind closed doors. In a series of painstaking discussions, leaders from both blocs explored ways to reduce nuclear stockpiles without sacrificing perceived security. Years of diplomacy culminated in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty (INF) of 1987, an unprecedented agreement signed by Reagan and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. For the first time, an entire class of nuclear weapons would be eliminated, with rigorous verification mechanisms ensuring compliance. The treaty was both symbolic and practical, a signal that dialogue could triumph over confrontation, and that decades of hostility might yield to cooperation. But the implementation of such treaties would face resistance, skepticism, and the ever-present risk of miscalculation. The 1980s also witnessed the rise of citizen diplomacy and international activism. Peace movements staged sit-ins, organized demonstrations, and petitioned parliaments, reminding leaders that the human cost of war was not abstract. Media outlets broadcast images of protesters and public gatherings, bringing the moral imperative of disarmament into homes worldwide. At the same time, intelligence agencies tracked arms development and assessed compliance with treaties, balancing the ideals of diplomacy with the stark realities of strategy. The stakes could not have been higher. A single misjudgment could unravel progress, ignite mistrust, or trigger confrontation. How long could these fragile agreements hold before global pressures forced their limits? In the halls of power, Reagan and Gorbachev forged a relationship that transcended ideology. They met in Geneva, Reykjavik, and Washington, each summit punctuated by tension, negotiation, and occasional breakthroughs. While ideological differences remained, a shared understanding emerged. Both nations recognized the catastrophic consequences of miscalculation. They explored reductions, inspections, and transparency measures that would have been unthinkable a decade prior. Yet, the process remained delicate. Entrenched military leaders, political hardliners, and global crises threatened to derail progress at every turn. Could mutual trust survive the inertia of decades-long hostility? By the end of 1987, the INF Treaty stood as a beacon of hope amid decades of fear. Europe's citizens had demanded change, leaders had risked political capital, and the specter of total annihilation had been partially restrained. The Cold War was far from over, but cracks were forming in the fortress of confrontation. Ordinary people and world leaders alike began to glimpse a path toward reconciliation, proving that diplomacy, activism, and courage could shape history. Yet the most pivotal transformations, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, were still a few years away, and the world would soon face new tests of resolve, trust, and vision. If you've been riveted by the tension and human courage of this era, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps share these stories, bringing the lessons of the Cold War to viewers across the globe. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union faced crises that no missile could solve. Its economy was stagnating, plagued by inefficiency, corruption, and a costly arms race it could no longer sustain. Oil prices had plummeted, and agricultural shortfalls fueled discontent. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in 1985, he inherited a superpower teetering on the edge of collapse. Determined to salvage both the state and its global standing, he introduced Glasnost and Perestroika policies aimed at transparency, political openness, and economic restructuring. The changes were revolutionary. Media censorship eased, public criticism of the government became permissible, and foreign investment was encouraged. Yet with openness came uncertainty. Could the Soviet Union survive the very freedoms Gorbachev was granting its citizens, or had he set in motion forces he could no longer control? Internationally, the West observed these reforms with cautious optimism. Gorbachev engaged directly with world leaders, meeting repeatedly with President Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Their discussions navigated decades of mistrust, addressing nuclear stockpiles, regional conflicts, and pathways to cooperation. The negotiations bore fruit. The Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty had already demonstrated what could be achieved, and momentum built toward more comprehensive arms reductions. Yet the path was fraught with tension. Conservative factions in both the USSR and the West questioned compromise, and every decision carried the weight of history. Could these tentative steps truly unravel decades of hostility without igniting new conflict? Inside Germany, the division that had symbolized the Cold War began to crumble. The Berlin Wall, once an unyielding barrier, became a focal point of public pressure and political change. Citizens in East Germany demanded freedom, protesting in the streets and challenging the legitimacy of their leaders. Governments wavered, unsure whether to suppress dissent with force or allow reform to unfold. On November 9, 1989, the wall fell. Crowds surged across checkpoints, chipping away at concrete barriers, embracing family and friends after decades of separation. The moment was electrifying, but the future remained uncertain. How would reunification reshape Europe? Could East and West overcome political, economic, and social divides after so many years? Meanwhile, conflicts elsewhere tested diplomacy and patience. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan signaled a retreat from overextension, but regional tensions remained volatile. Arms reduction negotiations continued, culminating in the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty START-I, signed in 1991. For the first time, concrete limitations were imposed on the world's largest nuclear arsenals. Verification mechanisms ensured compliance, building trust that had once seemed impossible. Leaders hoped these treaties would prevent another era of confrontation. Yet the collapse of the Soviet Union loomed, threatening to reshape the geopolitical landscape entirely. Would new nations emerge peacefully, or would instability ignite unforeseen conflicts? As 1991 progressed, the Soviet Union dissolved into 15 independent states, ending the Cold War not through battlefield victory, but through negotiation, reform, and the persistent pressure of civic action. The ideological struggle that had dominated the second half of the 20th century appeared to fade, replaced by cautious optimism and new uncertainties. NATO and former Warsaw Pact nations faced the challenge of redefining security, alliances, and cooperation. Citizens reflected on decades of fear, realizing that survival had hinged not only on missiles and treaties, but on the courage, negotiation, and vision of leaders and ordinary people alike. By the decade's end, a world once shadowed by nuclear annihilation and ideological confrontation had entered a fragile peace. Diplomacy, activism, and reform had combined to avert catastrophe, demonstrating that even the most entrenched rivalries could be overcome. Yet history would continue to test these lessons, reminding humanity that vigilance, dialogue, and understanding are never optional. The Cold War was over, but its legacy lessons of fear, courage, and compromise would echo for generations. And as the Berlin Wall became a monument to resilience, the world understood that the future is shaped not only by the powerful, but by those who dare to imagine peace amidst peril.